Sometimes when we speak up here, the minister sometimes is preaching to himself. And I certainly feel that today. In the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We'll begin at verse 7. Unless I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of revelation, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. Have you ever had trouble with sin? Yeah. That Paul, in his time on this earth, he had now think about it, he did have an abundance of revelations. In this chapter, he talks about when he was caught up into the third heaven. Not many people get to see that and come back and talk about it. And he said he saw things that were not lawful for him to utter. In other words, you can't really put into words what he saw. The amazing things that he saw. That Jesus described it on the cross as paradise. Now, there's places on this earth we like to be in, aren't there? Especially even here in Tennessee in the springtime. That's about as good as it gets, right? About 70, in my view, 70 degrees, sunshine. But what you get in glory exceeds even that. And the Apostle Paul and the Apostle John got to have glimpses of that. If you look in the book of Revelation, that's where some of the visions that John has come from the very throne room of glory. And by His grace, we'll get to be there one day, right? And stay there. In the very presence of God. But until you get there, you got to deal with sin. And in the case of the Apostle Paul, he has an issue with pride. And I would say that if I had those things, I would have an issue with pride too. He's doing things that not many people get to say that they've done or seen this side of glory. But he's got a problem. He's got an issue. He's dealing with Satan buffeting him. You know what it means to buffet? To buffet means to strike with your fist. So he's got a thorn in the flesh, and it looks like the messenger of Satan to buffet him. He's having troubles. There are things that are beating him down. Now, in this case, it's the messenger of Satan. Can it ever be times that your own sin breaks you down? Have you ever had a time in your life where sin was the culprit of your troubles? I've had that. Very recently, as a matter of fact. But what does our text now say? And he said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. So is God's grace sufficient for you? Now, is God's grace sufficient for you even when you are the culprit? I say the Lord's been good to me. Even though I haven't always done like I should do. Have you ever been there? I've been there. But God's grace does not change even though we don't do well. Have you ever been on those roads before? Have you ever seen that? That you didn't do exactly the way you should, but the Lord was still there. And the Lord knows. But it didn't change your position at all, did it? In the eternal sense. And the relationship with God the Father. Think about this. That Peter denied that he even knew who Jesus Christ was. Now, just a few hours before that, he said he would go with the Lord even unto death. And I'm sure that Peter meant it. What do you think? But Peter, when he had denied the Lord on the third time, what did it say in the book of Luke about that? It said that the Lord turned and looked on Peter. Now, did the Lord know where Peter was? Does the Lord know when you are when you've done the wrong thing? Now, the question is, how do you think the Lord looked on Peter? Now, you could say in judgment, and you probably could be right, do you think the Lord still loved Peter? I think he did. Think about Peter's life after the Lord's crucifixion. Peter became a pastor and a preacher that had a lot of success, wrote 2 epistles to the strangers scattered throughout Pontus, Asia, and Bithynia. And he was able to recount when the Lord transfigured himself and revealed his portion of his glory to them. That Peter messed up. You're messed up. Have you ever come short of the glory of God? Does that change your position in the Lord? Not at all. That's the good news of it. It says, my grace is sufficient for thee. God's grace was sufficient for Paul to continue to serve his churches, didn't it? Is God's grace sufficient for us to serve him? In the book of Hebrews, he says, let us have grace whereby we may serve thee acceptably with reverence and godly fear. Is that grace enough for us to do that? Is God's grace able to help you overcome the trials that you have? Because we couldn't serve God without him. Peter couldn't have gone beyond his time that he denied that he even knew who the Lord was, except the Lord bless it with his grace that is sufficient. Because listen to what it says. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. God's sufficient grace is enough to fill in the details. What do you think about that statement? Even though we missed the mark. The Apostle Paul, even in the book of Romans, he says, "O wretched man that I am." Do you think Paul still had an issue with sin? How did it says in the first letter to the Corinthians that he labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. So when you're doing things that honor and glorify God, it's because of the grace of God, right? But if we're able to, but there are times that we're going to do things and say things and acknowledge things and make a mess. I can testify to that. But God does not leave us or forsake us in spite of that. That's good news to me. Let's see if that holds out in any other scriptures. Let's go to the book of 1 Peter chapter 4. Verse 12 of the 4th chapter of 1 Peter says, "Beloved, think it not strange the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you. You see, you're going to be tempted to do the wrong things and say the wrong things and all those things. You're going to have trials and tribulations, right? Yeah. You're going to miss the mark at times, I'm sure. I've done it before. But it's not something you're not the first one to ever deal with these things, guys. As a matter of fact, in the book of Hebrews, it says that the Lord himself was tempted in all points like as we, yet without sin. So you say, well, nobody knows what I go through. Well, the Lord does. He was tempted in every way. And every time you see him tempted, you see him answer with Scripture. How many times have you seen the Lord say, as it is written? Think about this. We encountered the two men on the road of Emmaus. And he was resurrected, and they didn't know who he was. And he said, why is your countenance fallen? And they said, well, the one we thought was the Messiah, he's been killed. But then the Lord went to the Scriptures, starting at Moses and the prophets, and declared the things of himself. Can you find things about the Lord in his word? Can he reveal them to you? Now he did to them, and they said, did our hearts not burn within us? Can the Lord bring things to your mind to make your hearts burn and glow? Even though we don't know all the information, right? They didn't know. Those two on the road of Emmaus, they didn't get it until later. But rejoice inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings, when he shall be revealed, that ye may be glad also with exceeding joy. Can you be thankful when you suffer for the Lord's sake? I'm going to tell you something. When you suffer, you're tempted to sin. Right? See, the devil knows when to attack. You know, guys, is the Lord able to deliver? But does Satan know how to attack? Look how sore he attacked Job. Job was in a miserable state, wouldn't you think? Even his wife told him to curse God and die. Not the best ideas to curse God in any way. But he was in a miserable state. They didn't even know who he was till he got closer. His three miserable comforters. They were supposed to be his friends. Let's go to the book of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In verse 12. It says, wherefore let him thinketh he standeth, take heed lest he fall. So you think you're standing up on your own 2 feet, right? Is there ever anything that can knock you off your feet? In a spiritual sense. Is there ever any time that there's going to be something that can get you off your game, if you will? You know, paraphrase for sports. Is there anything that gets you off your game? Anything gets you off track? Verse 13. There is no temptation taken you, such as is common to man. But God is faithful. That is one thing that kind of resonates all the time. think about it. If you remember when Jeremiah, he recounted all the troubles that he'd been having in the book of Lamentations, chapter 3. He recounts all the wormwood, the gall, the troubles, the trials. And he's just he forgot prosperity. But then he says, great is thy faithfulness. He had hope because of the faithfulness of God. That God is always there. His grace is always sufficient. So let's see what it says. There is no temptation taking you, but as such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able. Some people kind of misapply that verse, and they say the Lord's never going to put anything on you that you can't handle. That's not what it said. Because is there things that you can't handle on your own? Has there ever been anything in your life that you were not able to handle by yourself? There's a lot in my life. There's a lot of it. And much of it's my own fault. But he said, will not suffer you to be tempted. You see, if you remember, we talked about Job a few moments ago. Satan had a discussion with the Lord. And did the Lord set the rules? Can the Lord still set the rules of where Satan can and cannot go? Can we look to the Lord for our help and guidance in these things? But the first thing it says in this, there's no temptation taking you, such as common to man. Man, throughout history, has been tempted with sin. And it's in your life. It's all around you. It's in your mind and in your heart, by the way. Your mind is enmity against God, and your heart is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. What do you need? You need God's grace, which is sufficient. Now let's see what it says on here, though. It says, but with the temptation also make a way of escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Who's going to give you the escape? The Lord. How are you going to bear it? The Lord. So was Paul able to bear the thorn in the flesh because of the grace of God? It didn't say the Lord took it away. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. The things that trouble us, can the Lord help us through it? Is the grace of God still sufficient now, just like it was then? Is it still good enough, if you will? Is God's grace still with you and able to deliver you now? As much as it delivers you to eternal heaven, which that's good. That's good news. But my friends, I need that grace every day. Because of my foolishness myself and the temptations that are to come. Can we resist the devil and he'll flee from us? Well, the only way you're going to do that is through the grace of God. That God being good to us to give us what we need. But we can get down pretty far, can't we? Let's take a look at that in the book of 2 Corinthians. Now, I want to tell you just a quick state in the first chapter. It says that we have the sins of death in us, in whom him who hath delivered, doth deliver, in whom we trust he will yet deliver. So Paul had seen that the Lord had delivered him before. And you see the Lord working in his life now, that he's delivering him now, and he will yet deliver again in the future. How do you know the Lord will deliver in the future? Here's the thing. Even if you die, you go to heaven. Is that a deliverance? Can the Lord deliver you from the present evil world like he told you in the Galatians that he could? But we go to the 2 Corinthians chapter 4 in verse 7. Come back up and get verse 6. For God, who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, has shined in our hearts to give light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. That's an interesting statement in and of itself, isn't it? He's troubled. They've got troubles. They're tempted, troubled, issues, but he's not distressed. I have a tendency when I look at the troubles to become distressed. What about you? Do you think the Apostle Peter got distressed when he looked at the seas around about him when he wasn't looking at the Lord when he was walking on water? How far did he walk? We don't know. Doesn't matter. His focus messed up while he started to sink. We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Let me pause right there. That is a huge statement, isn't it? That you are not forsaken. What did he say? He told us in the book of Matthew, the last verse, Lo, I'm with you always, even unto the end of the world. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 13, he says, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Do you think that's true for every child of grace? Isn't that something? They would never leave us nor forsake us even when we mess up. Persecuted but not forsaken, cast down but not destroyed. Have you ever felt cast down? Have you ever felt about as low as you can go? Are you thankful that the Lord did not destroy? I want to ask you a question. Do you think the Lord has the right to destroy? Does the Lord have the prerogative to destroy you? Why? Have you ever messed up? He says in the book of James, he's guilty of one, he's guilty of it all. You know, I mean, it's really, how easy is it to get yourself off the course and off track? How easy would it have been for Paul to do the same thing? He say in these verses, he says he's troubled, perplexed, persecuted, and cast down. Have you ever been all those things at once? But was the Lord gracious to say that he's not completely destroyed, not in despair? Why? Because he's not forsaken. Sometimes we feel like we're forsaken, don't we? Think about that. A verse that my dad has used at a funeral even. Behold, he hath graven us upon the palms of his hands. When he wants you, see you, there you are. Right? Does that ever change? No, we're always graven on the palms of his hands. I mean, think about it. I mean, how long have some of those things been graven on those tomb rocks out there? Some of them near 100 years, right? But it's still there. Well, when you graven something on the Lord's hands, that will never change. It won't wash off, right? But the statement before that is what's kind of odd. the statement before he says, I have thee graven upon the palms of my hands, Zion hath said that the Lord hath forsaken us. Why hath the Lord forsaken them? No. Do you think Zion could have forsook the Lord, though? Forsook him in their minds and their hearts? Not followed him, not looked to him for their help and guidance? Have you ever seen that? Have you ever been guilty of that? I have. I'll tell you I have. But we're still graven upon the palms of his hands. His grace is still sufficient for thee. So can we trust him? You see, that's the point. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, it says for you to bring forth the first fruits. That sounds good, right? Or also in the book of Malachi, it says bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse. But for you to be able to do something like that, in verse 9, it tells you to bring the first fruits. In verse 5, it says tell you to trust in the Lord. Lean not to your own understanding. If you look at it with your own understanding, you're going to miss the mark. You're going to miss the point. You're going to get distressed, perplexed, and troubled in your mind. Unless you focus on the Lord. And also, I want to also point out something. I've pointed this out before, but I think it bears record here. In our text in 2 Corinthians, in the 12th chapter, it says, for this thing I besought the Lord thrice. How many times do you think you should come before the Lord with these things? How often do you think you should bring the thorn in your flesh, whatever it may be, to the Lord? In this case, Paul said he brought it 3 times. He got an answer. Let's take a look at the book of Luke, chapter 18. In Luke 18, the first verses, we'll start at verse 1. In the 18th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint, saying, there was in a city a judge which feared not God, neither regarded man. And there was a widow in that city, and she came unto him, saying, avenge me of mine adversary. Have you got an adversary? Have you ever had an adversary? Have you ever had an enemy that troubled you? I want to tell you, my biggest adversary is the one that looks at me in the mirror. But we also have the devil, right? And he's an adversary. We have many adversaries, can't we? Now let's see what it says. And he would not for a while, but afterward he said with himself, fear not God, nor regard man. Yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. Well, how did she come to him? Continually. How should we come to God? Continually. See what it says, verse 6. And the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge saith. And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear along with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? How often did the elect come? This elect people, they said, so there's the Lord preaching election. What do you think? There is an elect, right? I had to throw that in there. I couldn't resist it. And it says, which cry unto him, which cry day and night. Can you pray day and night for the same thing? Think about that. I mean, the Lord does not have to operate on your time scale. But do you think the Lord's grace is still sufficient to see you through when you cry day and night? Do you think if you cry day and night, He gives you a new supply of grace day and night? And is that grace enough? Oh, it's sufficient, isn't it? Though He bears along with them. Now let's read the next parable that He presents. Let's take a look at it real quick. In verse 9, it says, and He spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Now, I don't think that the Apostle Paul despised others, but he did have an issue with pride. We've talked about that just moments ago. We're going to find somebody else that has an issue with pride. Let's take a look. Verse 10. Two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are. Now, here's the first thing. This publican, this Pharisee was just like other men. He was a sinner. He didn't think so. But every person that's walked this earth is a sinner. There's none that doeth good, no, not one. So let's see what it says. It says, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I want to ask you a question. Do you think that's as good as coming to the Lord to avenge you of your adversaries? Do you ever think that the God's grace sufficient might be just Him being merciful to you, a sinner? Have you ever been a sinner? Well, you are a daily one. I want to tell you, I've seen in my life that the Lord is still able to bless in spite of my own failings. Can God be merciful to us as sinners? Sometimes we approach prayer almost like we're asking for something, but sometimes we just need to say, Lord, you know what I need better than I do, just be merciful. Now here's some good news for you. What does it say, verse 14? I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Who does that? The Lord. Who exalts? The Lord. When you're cast down, who can lift you up? When the Lord is with you, are you right where you need to be? So back in our text, he said, lest I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of revelation there was given unto me a thorn in the flesh, as a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee. How many of you are thankful to know that God's grace is still sufficient? Even though we don't see it sometimes, we don't acknowledge it. My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. That Paul would have no strength at all unless the Lord gave it to him. Now, how much strength does the Lord have? In your trial and your trouble and everything that goes on, how much power does God have? He is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that you ask or think. That's good news to me. How about you? But we got to remember it. Sometimes we miss it. Can the Lord bring these to your mind? Can the Lord's grace still deliver you? Whatever your trial is that you're facing, whatever temptation that you are looking at, can the Lord deliver? Well, he delivered 3 Hebrew children from a fiery furnace, Daniel from a den of lions, and David from a Goliath. God's grace is still sufficient to deliver you. May the Lord bless you and keep you as I pray.